So again, we've got another stellar panel. We've got Florian, I think everybody's here. We'll start with Florian, then Vinicius Navarro and Anna Veal, and then Dan Fetzner and Martin Dornberg. So again, there's going to be a lot in this, but there should be some time for questions before we break for lunch. So we've got an hour, just under an hour and a quarter. So as you know, this session is being recorded. So if you don't want to be recognized, just turn your cameras off and perhaps change your name or whatever. But we hope that you will interact with the conversation. We want as much audience participation as possible. So our first speaker then is Florian Thalhofer, and he is going to very briefly introduce himself. Are you able to put your own bio into the chat, Florian? That's a bit of a multitasking job there.
I can do that after the talk.
Okay. All right. I tell you what, I'll do it for you.
No, it's actually great. It's actually quite a good idea to not put it into the
all right.
after the talk.
Okay, you go for it.
So I have 11 minutes. I timed it yesterday, so I need 11 minutes.
Yeah.
My name is Florian Thalhofer. I have just started a practice-based PhD. My main supervisor is Judith Aston, and I am working in a research team on interactive narration at HSLU in Lucerne, headed by Florian Krautkrämer. My background is that of an artist. Until recently, I have never worked in a scholarly way, in reading, understanding, and writing. I have been working on a scholarly talk for weeks that I have to deliver in a couple of days, and writing these talks turns out to be really difficult for me. Clearly, I'm not a scholar yet. To calm my nerves a bit, and because I really want to take the opportunity, especially here at iDocs, to get your take on something that I have found. Where am I? Now I got lost. That I've heard about. I will try something completely different today. Today, I'm going to tell a story. No, I'm not in the business of storytelling, but today is the day. This is a story about Jan, a guy that I happen to know. Jan wanted to be a storyteller, and he thought it is extra cool if you tell a story in a non-linear way. And because Jan did not find a tool that he could use, Jan made a tool himself. He created a software. That was a terrible idea because the software that Jan made turned out to make it impossible to tell good stories. The stories that Jan made with his software were really boring. The software in that sense was a complete failure. Jan says that there is no such thing as an exciting nonlinear story. It does not exist. There is no one that finds nonlinear stories exciting. I know. Jan does not know because Jan does not know all the people on the planet, but Jan was hanging out at festivals and conferences on nonlinear storytelling since 2001, talking with other people about his software and other things. Jan says he has never met a single person that thinks nonlinear stories are exciting. Interesting, maybe. Interesting is the term that people usually use in this context. Jan was invited to all kinds of festivals: film festivals, media art festivals, theater festivals, dance festivals, literature festivals. Jan was usually picked up by a car at the airport, got a hotel room, was fed well, and there were usually free drinks. Jan certainly noticed that the part of the festivals that he was in was actually just a small appendix to the real festival. That took place at a main venue space, while Jan and people like Jan met in a separate space, separated from the real festival, usually a different building. Jan did not care. This was normal. Jan always met the same people at those festivals, often literally the same, but always the same kind of people. So who were those people? In 2011, he was invited to a festival that was somehow different. It took Jan quite a while to realize. Jan was not picked up by a car at the airport, which he didn't mind, but he noticed. Then there was a hotel as usual. He was fed and there were drinks, but he did not meet his people in a separate building to the real festival. He was in fact quite confused that there was no real festival separate to the section that he was in. This was, of course, the first IDOCS conference. Who were these people? All the people seemed to come from all kinds of areas: film, documentary, business, biology, academia, non-academia, whatever. And now they even had a festival on their own. And why were they all interested in boring stories? Who were these people? And then it clicked for Jan. These people were all multiperspectival people. Most likely Jan had picked up the term multiperspectivity at one of those festivals, quite likely at IDOCS, and then he used that term to look at himself and his family, his friends, all the people he knew. He found there were a few multiperspectival people, and then there was the rest, for which Jan picked the term monoperspectival. Jan soon realized that it is actually not that binary. People are usually not either one or the other, but more or less in between, somewhere on the scale of perspectivity. Jan made that up. There is no such scale, but Jan nevertheless used it to get a better understanding of him and the world around him. Jan made lots of notes and got so obsessed about mono and multiperspectival thinking that even his closest friends asked him to not use the word multiperspectival in their presence any longer. He even invented 2 new letters for mono and multiperspectival thinking to speed up his note-taking. Jan talked to me about a couple of his findings. I don't know what to make of it, and this is why I would like to ask you for advice. Jan certainly finds his findings useful, and he claims that it has improved his life. Jan says, being mono and multiperspectival are both talents, and usually people are more talented on one or the other side. He says communication between mono and multiperspectival people is extremely difficult, if not at all impossible, at least at the current stage. When Jan meets someone new, he usually performs a quick scan. And if he finds that this person is more on the monoperspectival side of the spectrum, Jan talks with this person about the weather, and usually not about much more. He avoids deeper conversation because they turned out to be too painful for him too many times. Jan says that he has over and over tried this, and this is what he now generally advises to himself. These are some of the indicators Jan uses to identify monoperspectival people. People that have a clear opinion, people that try to convince, people that don't like to be interrupted, people that want to stay with a topic, people that don't like to talk about personal things, people that by default tend to mistrust systems and authorities, people that make jokes that Jan does not consider to be funny, people that talk about decisions and consequences. There are some indicators, these are some indicators Jan uses to identify multiperspectival people. People that talk about options and possibilities, people that doubt their own opinion, people that are curious about other opinions and seem to understand them, people that like to talk about personal stuff without bragging, people that jump wildly between topics, people that tend to forget important information when telling something, people that talk a lot and interrupt each other in conversations, people that by default tend to trust systems and authorities, people that struggled in school, people that make jokes Jan finds funny. According to Jan, these are some of the things multiperspectival people seem to be particularly good in. Recognizing new options and possibilities, coming up with different ideas, different to the convention, accepting complexity and being okay to not understand certain things, trying out things, accepting mistakes and learning from them, not being confused by new knowledge, being optimistic. And finally, according to Jan, and these are some of the things monoperspectival people seem to be particularly good in. Making decisions fast, making and sticking to plans, making convincing arguments, alerting people of imminent dangers, understanding things to a relatively high level of complexity. Jan thinks that multiperspectival people can understand monoperspectival thinking as monoperspectival, as a monoperspectival viewpoint is just another way of many possible viewpoints for someone who is multiperspectival. But the other way around, it is really tricky, according to Jan, and he asks, how do I explain to my brother that there are multiple ways to look at something if he himself can only see one angle? What do you think? Is there a way to explain multiperspectivity to monoperspectival thinkers? Is this even a thing? How do you deal with this problem when you are dealing with people that are on the monoperspectival side of the spectrum? Or didn't you come across this problem at all? How do you relate to what Jan says? And apart from his stance that, apart from the fact that his stance might be overly simplified. So do you think Jan's thoughts are helpful? Thank you very much.
Everyone's stunned to silence. We'll have to wait to reply. So we've got more speakers. Ella, are you muted?
Oh, sorry, I'm muted, yes.
Yeah, that was what was happened. Yeah. It's Vinicius next.
Yes.
Yeah.
Hello. Should I start? Should I go on?
Yes, please do start.
I love this story, by the way. Well, thank you for having me here. This is my first IDOC Symposium, and it's a real pleasure and an honor to be with you. I should start by saying that, well, I don't have as interesting a story as Florian, so I guess we could call it multi-genre panel as well. I should start by saying that, the examples that I have, they are all examples from database documentaries, although I know I am aware that the field of IDOCs has expanded in the last few years. So let me start by saying then that crises are highly mediated events, even when, and can I, well, sorry about this. Can I share my screen? Yeah?
Yes, please do. Okay. Is that working? Yeah, there we go.
Okay. Go this way. Does that look right? Yes? Okay, thank you.
Perfect.
Okay, so here I start again. So crises are highly mediated events. Even when we experience them firsthand, that experience is often amplified by the use of different media. Marianne Dawn once described crisis as one of the three modes of through which television apprehends the event, the other two being information and catastrophe. Each allegedly corresponds to a particular organization of time. Information, and I quote here, is a constant, steady presence. Catastrophe suggests the opposite. It has no extended duration. And I quote again, its timing is that of the instantaneous, the moment, the punctual. Crisis would seem to stand somewhere in between. Its temporality is condensed by the momentous nature of the event, yet it is not reduced to the instantaneity of the moment. Marion-Dawn's article refers to a media landscape very different from ours. It was first published at the end of the last century, when many of the experiences we now take for granted were not yet available. Yet, temporality remains key to how contemporary media apprehends lived reality, if for no other reason, because that relationship now seems more diffuse, less predictable. Crisis, to take the example that interests us here, seem at once perennial and perennially mediated. The decisive force suggested by the term's etymology being lost to the habituation of crisis. And I am borrowing the term habituation of crisis from Wendy Chun, although she uses that in a somewhat different way. How then might iDocs, typically a 21st century media form, respond to this scenario? How do they engage with crisis? And how might they reclaim crisis from habituation? My answer to these questions is an attempt to respond to the general theme of the conference, iDocs, Multiperspectival Thinking, Crisis. It also comes from an interest in exploring the temporality of iDocs and how that may help us engage with crisis. As has often been said, the temporal experience afforded by interactive documentaries is heterogeneous. And this heterogeneity is a function of a multiplicity that inheres in the iDoc experience, multiplicity of media, still and moving image, for example, of subjects and perspectives, of levels and forms of engagement between documentaries and their users. And these are two screenshots from Jerusalem. We're here just to get, to remind ourselves of the heterogeneous nature of the temporality of the iDoc experience. You would encounter this as a still image, click here, and then move on to, and then watch the video of the Greek club in Katamon, that East Jerusalem neighborhood, which is the subject of the documentary. What gives order to this multiplicity is a design perhaps most easily apprehended as a spatial configuration. The iDocs interface and the navigation paths available to the user, for example. And then, this is of course, Gazas Derov. Interest in the temporal aspects of the documentary, however, may reveal other ways of ordering the iDoc experience. iDocs can give order to multiplicity by offering a qualitatively different temporal experience, one that stands out from the usual, the same way that any given occasion might stand out from the ordinary. The emphasis here is on the particular character of the occasion rather than its duration. Kairos rather than chronos, to use two Greek words for time. Mm-hmm. Chronos designates time that can be measured, quantified. Kairos refers to time that is qualitatively distinct. It is usually translated as the right time, the opportune moment. It can also refer to a critical time when something must be done, an opportunity that will be lost once that moment has passed. This is the iDoc, not as artifact, but as opportunity for exchange, as gathering of interested participants, as has been discussed by a number of iDoc scholars, Pat Zimmerman, Helen de Michel, Mandy Rose, to mention only a few. It is also the iDoc as an experience defined by addition rather than synthesis, by dialogism rather than dialectics. These are, of course, features shared by iDocs that may not address or engage with crisis at all, but they seem to offer an apt response to the question, how do iDocs engage with crisis? Without coinciding with the crisis itself, this qualitatively different temporal experience can help disentangle crisis from habituation. iDocs create opportunity to engage with crisis as crisis. Moreover, the particular occasion that helps define the iDoc experience can produce a sense of shared reality when that sense of shared reality may be lacking elsewhere. In this case, the iDoc also models a form of engagement with lived reality in which shared reality serves as the basis for addressing critical situations. This is a shared reality that accepts and welcomes difference. It does not require agreement. It need not be contained within the bounds of community. And this is where I find one of the most interesting intersections between iDocs, multivocality, and crisis. Not that I lack interest in community, or am not willing to embrace the potential of interactive documentary media to build community. Building communities of interest is a remarkable way to connect documentary media and lived reality. But commonality and agreement need not be a precondition for sharing reality. In some ways, responding to crisis might demand precisely that we establish a sense of shared reality based on difference. And here's what I have in mind, Casas de Roo again. And this I am indebted to Judith Butler, who has argued that our lives are co-implicated, even if we do not belong to the same community, and who calls for an ethics of cohabitation, even if cohabitation involves disagreement, discomfort, friction. Butler is not alone in calling for an ethics of cohabitation. A few years ago, Bruno Latour made a similar call, insisting that we must learn once again how to live in the same world if we're going to confront that which is probably the most consequential crisis of our time, climate change. At the root of that crisis, Latour argues, is the loss of a sense of shared home, of shared destiny. That loss is made worse by another related loss, the loss of a consensus-based reality. Climate change deniers can then say, there is no such a thing as climate change in my world. As for your world, it doesn't exist. The chasm here is not just between different narratives and issues we're familiar with, but between different worlds. If there was a time when we fought over how to represent reality, now we must fight for the reality we can represent. And here I may be inching towards the subject of Anna Ville's presentation, but I'm almost done. The second crisis mentioned by Latour, a crisis of credibility, is of relevance to all documentary media. By giving us a sense of shared reality based on difference, iDocs can offer a response to that crisis too. But perhaps the most ambitious, if also somewhat elusive, achievement we can expect from this sense of shared reality is the modeling of a world based on cohabitation, difference, and exchange. And this has as much to do with action in the present as it does with the imagination of possible futures. Thank you.
Yeah, that was fascinating. Thank you very much. So many great ideas today that I feel like we're going to need another day for discussion afterwards. I love that idea about agreement not being a precondition for a shared reality. It's really, really important. But yes, questions at the end. Sorry, I'm breaking my own rules, but Anna, you're up next. Great. If you could start off when you're ready.
Almost ready. So here we go. There is no one solution, and I think it quite matches what we have just been listening to. Well, the point of departure is the fact that we are currently facing various crises: geopolitical, economic, social, environmental, and that we are confronted with the fact that these crises are not chasing one the other, as one might think. Rather, they are all intermingled. In junction with these intertwined crises comes a fact which makes the situation even more serious. It is a crisis of representation of this crisis. Though, as the title of my presentation already indicates, I'm far from presenting one solution, which would be quite controversy speaking at a conference dedicated to pluriperspective thinking. I would nonetheless attempt to envision some possible answers, some possible venues out of, rather right through the double crisis. Building on Guattari's ecosophical thought of three interdependent ecologies, the prolongation in the environmental humanities, and recently emerging discourses in documentary theory on co-creation, polyphony, and of course, images of ecology and ecology of images. In order not to get lost in this complex entanglement, guiding questions can be: is there anything in between, maybe even beyond paralyzing eco-dystopian and naive eco-to-utopian narratives? How can one communally raise awareness of imminent ecological crisis and at the same time co-creatively awaken a desire for a more sustainable world? And how can one encourage multilogue to effectively and cognitively embrace complexity and to instigate transformation? The general hypothesis underlying my approach to these questions is that, yes, iDocs bear the potential to face both crises. And it is especially those configurations which are based on principles of polyphony and multiperspective thinking that are the most promising venues here. Their openness, I will claim, does not only do justice to complexity and the entanglement of issues at stake, but it can also teach us to listen and to take a viewpoint as an inspiration and not as an explanation. Foremost, however, they enable us to imagine change, open our minds for transformation, and assume agency, individually as well as a society. And given both the indeterminacy and yet multifaceted entanglements of actors, interactive documentary interventions help us to transcend binarisms. However, as time is scarce, let me jump right into the topic and fuel our think tank with some impulses, taking from Guattari's ecosophy. Let us first zoom in into Guattari's thought, and then zoom out again to gain the glimpse at the bigger picture and the connections between iDocs, multi-perspective thinking, and how they relate to Guattari. Guattari claims that traditional environmentalist perspectives obscure the messy entanglements of relationships between humans and the natural environment. Through their maintenance of the dualistic separation between the natural, non-human, and the human, cultural. To bridge this artificial gap, he envisions ecosophy as a new field of philosophy and research, postulating a pluralistic, multi-perspective approach to such an endeavor. In one of his seminal writings in this context, The Three Ecologies, Guattari suggests that life is constituted by three distinguishable but corresponding ecologies: the environmental and the social and the mental. The first two, the environmental and the social, seem to be fairly straightforward. The first refers to the material world, or what is usually understood by natural environment, or the observable. The second, the social, comprises the realm of intersubjectivity, the cultural and the world inhabited by us as experienced subjects in interaction with one another. The third ecology, is less easily accessible than the first two ones. Following Ivakiv, in his reading of Guattari, it can be described as an intermediary register between the first two. The idea of a mental ecology is intended to suggest that we humans are embodied agents and interpreters of a world that is not only there to be perceived, but also perceive and communicative in its nature. Perception or mind, understood in the sense and world-making capacity intrinsic to all experience, is the interactive dimension through which a world comes into being for world-bearing beings. In this context, at least three issues are important, also with regard to the connection to IDOCs, the environmental crisis, and the crisis of representation. First of all, it is important to emphasize that the mental cannot be thought of without reference to the physical world. Secondly, though stressing the entanglements of all three spheres, Guattari rejects the idea of holism. Rather, he underlines heterogeneity and difference, describing the interdependent entanglements between them as assemblages, contaminations, encounters, and multiplicities. And thirdly, which links to the presentations before, the temporal dimension of these entanglements. In contrast to teleological thinking, narratives of progress, and also often capitalist narratives of growth, ecosophical thinking stresses the fact that these entanglements have their own temporal dynamics. As Anat Singh claims, it is necessary to counter a dominating singular mode of futurity with a temporal polyphony. This enables us to go beyond anthropocentric perspectives of unidirectional linearity, to think entangled ways of existence with different rhythms and cycles. At this point, at the latest, interactive media practice and practices of mediation come into play, and with them, the diagnosed crisis of representation, which creates a world without accountability, responsibilities for current crisis. Speaking from the position of a philosopher and psychoanalyst, Guattari diagnoses, humanity seems to have lost its head, or more precisely, its head is no longer functioning with its body. How can it find a compass by which to reorientate itself within a modernity whose complexity overwhelms it? In remaking social practices, Guattari thus advocates for the invention of new collective assemblages of enunciation, to reconnect the head to the body, to join science and technology with human values, and to agree upon common projects while respecting the singularity of individual positions. Because, underlining again the interdependence of all spheres of life, without a change in mentalities, without entry into a post-media era, there can be no enduring hold over the environment. Yet, without modifications to the social and material environment, there can be no change in mentalities. This finally leads him to postulate the necessity of founding an ecosophy that would link environmental ecology to social ecology and to mental ecology, and to call for a new ethico-aesthetic paradigm. Let us now zoom out again at this point to gain a glimpse at how this relates to IDOCs and our overarching concept of multi-perspective thinking. In this regard, key concepts can be found in the four, again, entangled clusters of approaching IDOCs, which I would like to go through following 7 red threads to sketch some answers to the question raised at the beginning. Co-creation and collective wisdom, non-linearity and temporal polyphony, open spaces, encounters and contaminations, and polyphony and attentive listening. Cluster 1. Collaboration, co-creation and collective wisdom as when used towards new collective assemblages of enunciation and transformative shifts. Secondly, there is non-linearity and temporal polyphony in multi-perspective idocs. As such, they are acknowledgements of the temporal polyphony and indeterminacy of nature time. Multi-perspective thinking in idocs invites us to deal with time differently, to make us both sensitive to the actual moment, and it embraces long-term engagement, recalibrating our sense of time by insisting on responsiveness, but at the same time expanding the time frame of consequences. Research 3. Multi-perspective idocs designed as open space practices are local, situated in concrete environmental ecologies and hyper at the same time. Hence, rather than deductive arguments or grand narratives, these practices build mosaics that are localized, multi-voiced, and reciprocal.
Anna, just jump in quickly. I think Judith's bell's going to come quite soon, so you might want to just think about how much time you got left, because you're already
Just 1 minute.
Yeah. Okay. Well,
Just wanted to hear it.
We have got multi-perspective thinking in idocs as opening space practices as catalysts for transformative encounters and contaminations of diversity. Fifth, idocs as polyphony, diversity, and attentive listening to marginality for inspiring creative flows. And this brings us to the celebration of complexity in idocs. And last but not least, seen through the lens of agentic multi-perspectivism and interactive documentary practices with engagement, this acknowledgement of multiplicity and diversity, as well as entanglements, goes hand in hand with a venue to individual and collective empowerment beyond crisis. It can serve to bridge the gap between space of vision, interaction, and action, thus contributing to overcoming both crises, the entanglement of environment crisis and crisis of representation. So I will stop here. And thanks.
thank you very much. Lots of fascinating ideas there as well. So we've got one more presentation. So we've got Martin and Daniel, and then we'll have some time for conversation about it. So yeah, ready when you are.
Yes, all right, thank you. Yes, Martin and me, we give you an insight in our ongoing research, Deglobalize, which is going on since 8 years now. And we are in a deep crisis, Martin and me. Maybe because we are using the wrong tool, Florian would say. We are still stitching to Clint. And because we started with Clint, and so we stick to Clint. And I tried to give this presentation in 10 minutes, which is quite demanding. So our current interest in Deglobalize is coming back to Chusi Parika and dealing with psychogeographies, the unavoidable condition of psychogeographies with real physical entities. And we think that media theories of the digital must therefore be turned from head to toe, reground themselves, re-territorialize themselves. They must become terrestrial, in the words of Bruno Latour, who was already quoted today several times. So we are focusing on a term which is coming up, ecolonial, eco like ecologic and colonial, so merge the two words, ecolonial processes of violence. And so our research Deglobalize, which started in India with a human-animal relationship 7 years ago.
Daniel, sorry, may I interrupt?
Yes.
Because like you are sharing your presenters' view, so maybe you want
Which is
to
good. Which is good. So
okay, good.
I did this deliberately because you can read the notes. So and you see which is coming in advance. So we started this with the human-animal relationships 7-8 years ago, and focusing on matters of facts in India with these e-colonial processes of violence, as you can see here. And then we went to Egypt and dealt with water and with waste, and came back to Germany during COVID. And now we made a trip in March to the Congo, dealing with questions of violence and care, with the ambivalence of violence and care. Also, we are aware of the binaries and we want to get rid of the binaries. Maybe Clint is not the right tool to get rid of that. Now, I make this a bit short here: extended mind, embodied interaction, inactive approach, embeddedness. I think we all agree on these terms in our theoretical point of view. The terrestrial turn that Bruno Latour is demanding for forces us to look for a zero-person perspective, like Morton says, and you can also combine that with the term of polyphony. And we are looking for a form of representation without a center that fridges at the edges, fading and wasting. And therefore we push our deglobalize.com as an interactive documentary embedded in immersive environments like installation, performances, interventions. So we use the iDoc always and situate it in other discourses where we meet people and gatherings and have discussions. So it's a tool of thinking or a catalysator in order to make things come into a flow. Now, our current focus is the Congo and the term of violence, matters of violence, and that started in a way with the Congo Conference in 1884. In Berlin, the earth becomes an available resource for the industrialized world by international law. The scramble for Africa began. Germany imported quantities of copper from Deutsche Südwest, from its colony. The Belgian king begins the cruel bleeding of the Congo. The Berlin Conference marks the beginning of the interaction of geological reality with media technologies. Now, that is a thesis by Parika that is very inspiring, to think hardware and software and the physical facts combined to colonialism and to Freud's theory of the unconsciousness, which he combines with the term of inner Africa by Jean-Paul. And that is in a way that we do not travel to the Congo. We did not travel to the Congo in cooperation with the Académie des Beaux-Arts in Kinshasa to observe the Congo or the violence outside, but to look in ourselves as 5 white men who traveled there and who want to explore their own stereotypes in a way. Okay, but the raw materials, according to Parika, are not to neglect. That is something that we just realized in the Ukrainian war, and the gas and so on. So we depend on physical entities. And we call this 4th chapter of Deglobalize Heritage Earth. And as I said, it turns from care to violence as ambivalent counter figures. So it's about, the search movement is about the geo-eco trauma, yeah, which happened to the world and which happens to all of us. And how can our tools like interactive documentaries contribute to understand this crisis? Now I make it a bit short here, jump a bit our understanding of we are looking for an Afro-European media eco-geology. As I learned today, Judith is a geographer from origins. So this is interesting, I didn't know that. But as I said, let's make things short to come to a discussion. Now we started from the network. Yeah, the term of the network, a bug-free, perfect, clean promise of participation and recycling, focusing on nodes. Maybe Bruno Latour started with the idea of the network as well. And from the network, focusing on the nodes, Tim Ingold is coming up with the idea of the meshwork. Yeah, and the meshwork is more about intermingling, mutual abrasion, focus on tangled relations and parasites, maybe more the in-between of the nodes and the entanglements and how things are connected and getting complex and getting ecological and all that. And since we are in a deep crisis, as I said, seriously, because we are looking for new theoretical anchor points for our thinking, we are looking for new tools. Unfortunately, I don't find an alternative to Clint. I haven't looked that much to Stornoway. I'm going to do that, or we're going to do that. But we are coming up with a term like the waste work, yeah, from network to meshwork, waste work. So the focus is on slow violence. We've got doubts in progress and in growth of knowledge, yeah, as moderns, as postmodern. We accept the finitude of things, in a way the non-recyclability, but in transformation, partially repression into the repository due to limited resources and to hard and software updates, yeah, like we saw in the presentation before by Vinicius Gaza-Sterot. And Gaza-Sterot is offline, it's not working any longer, like Alma, yeah. So we also depend on how long is our software running. And so we are in a way facing limitations and the permitted death, as we said. Now, Judith opened the day in her keynote talking about hope. Yeah? And in this chapter 4 of Deglobalize, we are focusing on the final things, on the final issues, and maybe on cruel things, on inner forces and violence. And but the next chapter will definitely be on hope. Thank you.
Thank you. It's fascinating and great to bring it back to hope at the end. I think it's really important to retain that focus. I'm sure there's lots of questions. I can already see Jasmine, Stefano, with hands up. Jasmine, do you want to take off some questions? Can Jasmine hear me?
I didn't raise my hand.
It
was just clapping.
Oh, okay.
But thank you.
Right, okay. Sorry, I misinterpreted.
But fascinating presentation. Thank you to all presenters.
Put you on the spot there.
And it's a long plan, and we always talk about it to get in touch with Florian, and maybe Florian can help us to solve the problem and our thinking problem. And we have to invite you, Florian, to Offenburg definitely for a workshop and to think about how using Korsakov.
I mean, I'm the worst person to ask about Korsakov. Seriously, I feel like that at the moment.
Judith, put your hand up.
Yeah, well, this business of tools, to just remind you again of the polyphonic documentary project, because that's exactly what we're trying to do. You know, keep these debates active, because if we haven't got the tools, all these ideas, you know, won't go anywhere if the tools sort of disappear. So that is important. But I just thought Florian deserves it to come back round to him, given that he asked all these questions, and given that we're online, really we should be going to the bar afterwards. And you know, Florian wants the feedback. And I guess my provocation is just around, you know, in my idealistic way, I like to think that neuroscience tells us that we're fluid and we're malleable, and that our personalities, you know, we can adjust and we can transform. And for me, with the climate emergency, we need to transform. You know, we need to transform our narratives of the world and the way we engage with the more than human and everything. So for me, multi-perspectival and mono-perspectival could be useful tools if we use them intelligently in different contexts. So I would like to think in my meta-modern way that it's not either or, it's and, but at the same time, you know, pragmatically speaking, you know, some people are more open to holding multi-perspectivity and other people aren't. So that's my provocation really. And again, that kind of debate, you know, can people change or are they fixed? I guess, I suppose it's a bit of both, isn't it? It always is. Do you want to say anything, Florian? Or
sorry. Can I? Because Anna raised her hand. I agree. I mean, I totally agree, and I think it's not like monoperspectival versus multi-perspectivity or so. So it is both. Like both are talents, and we need both. But like I think that in the past, like due to the structure of media, also monoperspectival thinking was dominant, was more dominant, and like now we have the chance to switch, like to hear like the multiple voices. Like these tools allow that, and like the great thing about climate change is that it pushes us there. Like we have climate change and we have the internet and we have like all kinds of possibilities that to tackle that. And I think yeah, it's good. Like I think about the world in a very positive way. I don't see that I don't see the problems, but like the possibilities that are out there. And I'm actually looking forward for the future, really.
I just want, and this is just a provocation, just in terms of your definitions, when you said that multi-perspectival people tend to mistrust systems and authorities, and mono-perspectival people tend to distrust them. I found that interesting because I like to think I'm multi-perspectival, but I also have what I would like to think of as a healthy distrust of systems and institutions. So that was one that that's just a piece of feedback from me.
Maybe I want to jump in that and clarify that. Like it doesn't mean that like if you are like if you have like a couple of points on the list of monoperspectival, then you are monoperspectival. So it is like I don't consider myself to be multi-perspectival. Like there is more room to become more monoperspectival. If I wish to become more monoperspectival, there is not even a need to go in that or that direction, because it's not a matter of good or bad or better or worse. So like, but like that's it.
Yeah, that's really interesting debate, and I think maybe how it relates to the extended mind idea, because if you think in a monoperspectival way, but you are aware of and accept that that's one way and other people are holding the other perspectives in their heads, then you're still part of a multi-perspectival assemblage, even if your personal brain is monoperspectival. See what I'm saying? Anyway, sorry, that's my 2 pence. But we've got questions from Tobias, Mike, and Anna. I think Anna was first, then we'll take Tobias and Mike.
Yeah, thanks. Me? Yeah, thanks a lot. I think I may be a bit confused with the metaphors, because I think a perspective is something that you can take on. It is like you can view, or you can have a view or a look on something from one perspective or the other, and you can take on different perspectives, and then in the end you can try to compare both perspectives. But a perspective isn't something that you are in my imagination or in my understanding. And then the next thing is with the thinking, that I think thinking and perspective somehow clash for me as a metaphor, because thinking is something that I always do from a certain standpoint where I am at the moment, and I can take different perspectives into account while doing the thinking. So I think this is where I somehow have the impression that don't yet fully understand what the difference between mono and multi-perspectival thinking and mono and multi-perspectival people is about, and maybe you can help me with my where I'm standing on the line.
Maybe Anna can explain that.
Oof. Well, I think it's a question of changing and changing one's position as an observer. And in fact, am I only one person or myself? That is the next question. Can't I look myself from various perspectives, from my perspective, from my viewpoint, as I'm not only one wholeness, I'm already a multitude myself. Taking up Guattari and his quite psychoanalytic perspective on this, he also says there is no such thing as an individual that is really one wholeness. Insofar, I don't think that these two don't work together. Not at all. I can have, I can be multi-perspective myself. I don't need others for that. Would this help, or is this absolute abstruse what I'm confusing and confused?
I'll just say, Anna, no, you're not.
And I would add, it's not just thinking is not just an active subjective thing, yeah, but we are thought also by things. So it's something that happens to us. If you look at the extended mind and our dealing with the external and with the media, so that is something that is doing us something with us. If that is thinking, Martin, we discussed that yesterday, if you can call that thinking or not, how would you differentiate as a philosopher subjective thinking and the thing that we are discussing here?
My English is not so good, and the questions are very complex. But what is our interest? Coping with our IDOC is the question if temporal or spatial agencies really interact with human and not human beings and interact with the IDOC itself. How can we get into touch with this real important question? And that concerns also the question of thinking, because in philosophy of Guattari or Deleuze, every medium is some sort of thinking, and medium means the represented and the representation. Yes.
At the same time. Mm-hmm.
At the same time, yeah.
And also the bodily aspect, which we had already when touching upon also the physical world and embodied knowledge, embodied thinking. I think we are also thought by our bodies.
And our crisis as Daniel and me at the moment is if we try to realize what Haraway's intends, situated knowledge, yes, or situated IDOCs. Yes, should IDOCs become more small, for example, or more implemented into political action? This is two difficult questions, yes, but do we have to lose our idealistic thinking about IDOCs, that there are networks or meshworks, but there are only some sort of meshworks, wasteworks, sorry, yes, that we lose control over the IDOC, that we lose, and the IDOC is producing waste, yes, and producing vulnerability, and yes, it's, or should we keep away the notion of IDOCs and only tell it some sort of archive, yes, this is the most polemic idea we got yesterday. Yes, it's that you make it a little bit smaller. Yes,
because we lost the confidence in the thinking process.
Michael Armstrong is hands up.
Yeah. Okay. Let's take Mike's question.
Not sure what I've got is a question.
Okay. Cool.
But it's about questions. So my initial thought was, well, hang on a minute. You know, you've got people are saying multi-perspectival people and mono-perspectival people. And in my mind, what comes up is people who have answers all the time and people who have questions all the time. And so those who already have the answers don't challenge their own thinking. Those who constantly challenge their own thinking often don't have the confidence to put forward the answers when they arrive at them. And you know, we have this sort of crisis of people with comforting, nice answers being easier to sell, shall we say. The other thing that then comes to my mind, thinking about questions, is depending on the framing of your question. Are you the oil company looking to exploit the oil field? Your question of the environment is, how much longer can I get away with this and still make a profit? When do I have to pull out? That sort of thing. As an environmentalist, it's how long have we got? And if you're a resident of somewhere like the Netherlands, it's how long have we got before we need to raise the tops of the dams or move our population away? And I think it's that, yeah, the scientific method asks a series of questions. Society has a tendency to frame the scientific method in, you know, the sort of colonizing classification sort of process of, can we divide people up into this kind and that kind? Sorry, that's just what we've just done. You know, it's more that thing of, the question, if you like, in my mind is should we be framing questions to the audience rather than providing answers to the audience and empowering the audience to answer the questions for themselves, and thereby each of the members of the audience arrive at their own answers that are meaningful to them. Sorry, that was a bit long-winded, but.
Yeah, so that raises an interesting question, I think. Like, who is we and who is the audience? And aren't we also the audience? And isn't the audience also we? So I think that, like, we are part of, like, humanity, and we are audience and the one that put the question. So we are the same. I would like go back to Toby's question. Like, I like the clarity of the questions a lot. And so, like, you were talking about, like, you can switch perspectives. I think it's not so easy, because you cannot switch perspectives as you wish. You can just switch to perspectives that are accessible to you. And that means, like, technically or conceptually, but also, like, how like what your mindset is like. So, like, my father, he could, of course, like, access all the perspectives that were available through the media, but, like, there were certain things that he just didn't like to think. Like, he did not like to imagine that someone who was in the Green Party or so was right in their thinking. So, like, that perspective was out there, would have been accessible, but, like, my father couldn't fulfill the stunt. And I think that perspectives very much influence the thinking, because, like, what you can see is basically the basis, or what you can take in is the basis of thinking. So, like, the more perspectives you can access, the bigger the variety of the possible thoughts you can have. Yeah, thank you.
Any other contributions to that discussion or questions coming in? I can't see any hands up. I think what we're speaking about just now made me think about language as well, and how kind of Anglophone our conversations often are. And I often think about the value of learning other languages is the value of learning other systems of thinking. And I think a similar point about the more perspectives you have, the more ways you can think about something. I think the more languages you have, be that kind of languages as we think of them normally, or kind of or literacies in different kinds of tech, the more ways of thinking that we have as well. And I think that kind of relates quite nicely to kind of the idea of decolonizing IDOCs and trying to bring in ways of thinking from different languages and different kinds of cultural systems as well.
Mm. Absolutely. I'm wondering whether we ought to kind of break for lunch, because it's...
Yeah, I think it can't hurt to break a little bit early because we've got a bit of a tight lunch break anyway. So if we break now, we've got 50 minutes, which would be adequate time hopefully to get some food. And
oh, actually, no, you're right. We've got till 1:15, haven't we?
We do, but I don't think we don't need to sit here in 5 minutes. There's no burning questions given we've got.
Fascinating discussion though.
Yeah, really fascinating.
Yeah,
I feel like I need to watch all these back because there's more in it that I
Absolutely.
can synthesize in one sitting.
Yeah, I mean, for me, it's just I was taught, when I did my PhD, that there's different pathways to knowledge, and that the really kind of the clever thing to do is to not kind of say, this is my pathway to knowledge. I'm a postmodernist, therefore modernism is dead. This is why I like metamodernism, because you can say, well, there's all these different pathways to knowledge, just like Anne-Marie with her fifth province. And what if we put them into dialogue? And now, with a lot of talk about indigenous knowledge systems as well, when we've got these massive problems to confront, particularly climate, which is, for all of us, but also polarization, there's a need to kind of, if you have that way of thinking where you can hold multiple knowledge systems, multiple pathways, you can, value. I mean, I was taught dialectical thinking. It's a standard, as a way of, you don't know anything about this subject, so you're going to go and you're going to research it, and you're going, or as an anthropologist, you're going to go and do field work, and you're going to immerse yourself in another culture, and you'll never, and the longer you spend somewhere, anthropologists are told don't go native, but actually if you spend time in a culture, that culture affects you and that becomes a part of you. So you're holding all these multiple perspectives, and you're holding all these different tools as pathways to knowledge, and I think that's empowering. So the more we can kind of not be afraid of that, but the more we can hold them, and that's to for me, this idea of IDOCs as holding spaces for having these kind of dialogues between different pathways to knowledge. It's that's the ideological potential, and of course it's not just this technology that enables that. It's Paulo Favero talks about IDOCs practices rather than IDOCs technologies. IDOCs as a way of thinking, and of course we don't have unique claim to that, because scientists are engaging with complexity as well. So IDOCs, where we draw the boundaries, I guess it's the non-linearity, and for me, where these ways of thinking are useful in other fields as well. So
definitely. Okay, you've raised some hands there, Judith. We've got Veliscus and Anna with some concluding thoughts. Veliscus, am I saying your name right?
And Anna hold their hands.
What, sorry?
Vinicius wants to say something.
Yes. Please go for it.
Just a few comments on what has been said. I love what Anna said earlier, sort of like, the nod to Walt Whitman, I contain multitudes. And I think we all do. But I think we are also monoperspectival sometimes. And that is not something that I look down on. There are moments in which that is useful, that is necessarily, active. When we are activists, I think that, that is a moment of dialectical thinking. That is a moment in which we need one particular direction. And I didn't want to comment on the technology itself. I think it was Florian who said that, that's the nature of IDOCs as well, is that here's a technological tool that allows us to nourish multi-perspectival thinking, but also, the same technologies that enabled that, also created echo chambers, right? Also created or nourished monoperspectival thinking. And that, I think, is part of the crisis of credibility, the crisis of representation. These two worlds coexist. A world that welcomes multi-perspectival thinking, and a world that, in a more radical way than I had known in my lifetime, places us in these echo chambers and prevents us from listening to others, precisely because we can afford to, because it is easier to, because we can deny difference, we can deny the existence of a world that is not ours.
Yeah, it's a great point. Anna, we're going to jump in with your contribution as well before we wrap up.
Yes, I tried to ask a question because I think what came out when really discussing all these multi-perspective thinking issues in this panel and having come full circle, I think it's the questions we've got to ask. And therefore, I was wondering whether it does not make sense really to question things more, and also to teach our students not to ask a research question and then give our answer, a quite linear way to the answer, but to ask open questions. And maybe that could be much more inspiring, teaching a kind of literacy and thinking and asking the right questions and being open then for attentive listening. And maybe that is where iDocs can help us, because here we have got again the linear and the non-linear element. I don't know any iDoc that absolutely restricts itself to absolute unordered non-linearity, but we have got linearity as well. And we have got voices that can be discerned. It's again the same thing with the entangled ecologies. They are separate, they're distinguishable, but nevertheless they are entangled. I think it's, as Judith said, it's not the either or, but it's meta-modern and it's both at the same time, and maybe oscillating between the two very nicely.
Completely. Okay, I think we should finish for lunch now because we're at time, but just to kind of flag that at the end, we've got half an hour allocated for a discussion to kind of summarize the kind of key points and findings and discussions and questions we've been having. So if there's things we haven't had time to discuss or things you want to discuss further, just note those down for that half-hour interval, because we invite more discussion at that point. But yeah, for now, we're going to break for lunch until 2 o'clock UK time. So thank you all for a brilliant set of presentations. It's been really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to more after lunch.
Yes, thank you. So we'll come back at what time? 2 o'clock
yeah.
UK time. So
Right.
yeah, thank you everyone. We hope to see you after the break. Well done.